Hello, everybody. Welcome to Forensic Friday. I am Shannon, your host. And of course, we have our researcher of everything in the criminal world, Kelly, and a special guest, Nikita Marzano, that is going to be our forensic expert today going through crime scene photos. So, Kelly, why don't you tell everybody what you're so spectacular at?
Oh, hi. Well, I have been researching pretty much everything related to Murdoch for the last year and a half. Extremely extensively. I have a background from having lived in South Carolina, extensively knowing people in all aspects of life there. I know a lot of people associated with this. And we, through Shannon, were able to get access to a lot of the photos from the Stephen Smith case. We've talked about this on other episodes, but something that I desperately wanted was to talk to an expert, somebody who has experience in analyzing corpses, deceased bodies, especially from crime scenes. So I went to my little place in my head and started racking through everybody that I know in my life from all my different groups. Who do I know? Who do I know? Who do I know? And I was like, oh my gosh, this one amazing girl from my Highland game world. I think she used to do something like medical examiner, but when I found out, I didn't even know what that was. But so I sent Nikita this blind message. Hey, am I crazy, or did you used to work with bodies? And anyway, she wrote me back. I was so excited. She has 10 years of experience being an assistant medical examiner in Philadelphia. Am I correct with that, Nikita?
Forensic autopsy technician.
Forensic autopsy technician. So I'm so excited to have her because she can give us her perspective. And I have so many questions too from things that I saw that hopefully maybe will make more sense, and maybe they're not something, or maybe they are, but we'll find out. And by the way, Nikita is an amazing Scottish Highland game athlete. She throws big logs and heavy weights. I did it too, but I mean, she's like at a pro level, like the top of the world. So it's kind of cool. If this were a movie, and unfortunately not real life, she's exactly who I would cast in this role. So I couldn't have found a better person. I'm very excited. Thank you for being here, and thank you for helping.
Thank you, Kelly. Like Shannon said, my name's Nikita. So I'll give you some of my background and my credentials. I worked in a major metropolitan medical examiner's office for 4 years where I gained a lot of knowledge. Prior to that, I went to college and got a bachelor's degree in forensic anthropology, and I actually interned at a medical examiner's office where I found my love for forensics. I just fell in love with the field. I really dedicated a chunk of my life to it. I went from one medical examiner's office to a coroner's office for a brief period of time, and then ended my career at another medical examiner's office. And I really helped at each one instill, standard operating procedures. And I just learned so much from the forensic pathologists I work with. And you really just, the amount of cases that came in, you see a wide variety, and you start to really pick up on things just working beside the doctors. So that's a huge part of the knowledge that I have, and why I'm here today. And like Kelly said, we met in Highland Games. I've been doing Scottish Highland Games for about 10 years now. I got into that because I did collegiate throwing. And I just absolutely love it. You meet friends from all over the world, and it's just a great experience.
We do want to give you credit, though. You have a world record.
Yes, I have a world record in something called the sheaf toss. So it's a 10-pound burlap bag stuffed with straw, hay, and basically you use a pitchfork and you throw that up and over a bar for height. And my world record's at 36 feet, and that was set in 2019.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Both of you for Highland Games, I'm going to curtsy, bow, whatever it takes. You guys are amazing. Everybody's seeing the photos right now. It's pretty spectacular what you do and what you're currently doing with your lives. You both are like just incredible, badass women, and I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. So moving forward to really how excited both me and Kelly are to have you, Nikita, going through the crime scene photos to really be able to tell us, the viewers, the listeners, what your perspective is on what happened to Stephen, what you see. So I'm going to let you take it with your perspective, what you saw as soon as you went through them.
All right, great. And I want to say thank you again for having me and, trusting me with these photos and even the report. So I spent a significant time going through everything that we had. I would love to start with the autopsy report that was done by the pathologist that performed his autopsy. And I kind of want to walk us through that because I think that'll help set the foundation for everything else I'm going to talk about. So I went through the report and it looks how it should. It's very informative, very detailed. They did a full exam, which they should have done, even if, say, this wasn't quite the case where somebody had this trauma in the middle of the road. Anyone that's found outside and no one knows what happened should be brought in for a full autopsy, a full exam. So that I'm happy to say that they actually did that. The significant findings, and I want to go through these so people can kind of understand the trauma that I'm going to get into with the pictures. There's brainstem stretch. So that is something that can happen in someone that gets whiplash, hyperextension of your neck. So you get hit, you come back. Significant trauma can stretch your brainstem, and it continues on with some bleeding in another area of the lower brain. He had contusions, it's a lot of right-sided trauma. So temporal lobe contusion, which is like bleeding on the brain underneath the skull. Extensive skull fractures, which we'll see in the pictures. You'll see how much damage was done to his skull from this blunt force trauma. He had a severe, very big right-sided laceration that went over from his forehead down across his eyebrow to almost cheekbone. I think it was about 7.5 inches that was measured at the time of the exam. And these lacerations can be caused by blunt force trauma. It was not a nice, clean looking laceration that someone could get, say, from a wound done with a knife or any sort of sharp object. Then he had abrasions on his right and left arms. That to me, we'll go over more in the photos, but they look indicative of some sort of like almost road rashy trauma to his arms. He also had a right shoulder dislocation, which again could either be from the trauma that was inflicted, blunt force trauma that happened to his head, or could have been from his body landing, given there's so much that we can speculate in the case. And then he also had blood in his airways, which I would associate from his head trauma. And I'll go more in depth how much head trauma there was that would cause blood to kind of seep down and get into his airways. So the cause of death that the the forensic pathologist that did his exam wrote blunt head trauma sustained in a motor vehicle crash, in which the decedent was a pedestrian struck by a vehicle. Then they left it pending, which is and they left the matter undetermined because they want more investigation by the police department. That's very normal for a medical examiner or forensic pathologist to do because they rely on the police department or whatever law enforcement agency to do their part in the investigation so they can actually put down a correct manner of death. So all the rest of his body, very unremarkable. And we use the word unremarkable when there's no trauma, nothing sticking out to us where it's like, okay, the spleen is lacerated, the liver's lacerated. So there was nothing like that, no blood anywhere in his abdomen. Even his legs look pristine. Normally, if someone is hit head on in a motor vehicle accident, a pedestrian's hit head on, they'll get something called a bumper fracture on their legs. So either their lower legs will break or their thigh. So their femur or tibia fibula. He had none of that. So like I said, he looked pretty pristine. So now I can go into the photos a little bit.
Well,
and
just to give the viewers and the listeners some perspective, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. Throughout your incredible dissection of the autopsy report. Thank you very much for your insight. That was, you had me on the edge of my seat. You did mention medical examiner and coroner. And for those who aren't aware, a coroner is an appointed position, where a medical examiner is, there's just so much more extensive education and knowledge required for this position. So I'd like you to give a better definition of the two, so people understand when you say medical examiner and you say coroner, there is a significant difference.
Yes, and I love this topic. This is a hot topic for me. I'm a little passionate about it, especially because I worked in both different offices. Medical examiner offices, everyone, all the pathologists that work there are certified forensic pathologists. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's a certified forensic pathologist that are doctors that studied probably pathology in med school, went back and did an additional 2 to 4 years of another residency to study forensic pathology. So it's a long time to get to where they're at. And then underneath them is like a forensic autopsy technician and so on and so forth, the death investigators and everything. Coroner's offices, coroners are actually an elected position. So they're a political position. It can be anyone. A lot of times, in some areas, they require the coroner that runs to be some sort of medical profession. Doesn't have to be forensic pathology, doesn't even have to be pathology, nothing of the sort. Coroner's kind of like, yeah. It's just kind of like this little chess piece, like it's just this political pawn, essentially. And then they hire people underneath of them to essentially like run the office. So then they have deputy coroners, which are like the investigators at a medical examiner's office that are the ones that go out, take the pictures. They're the ones with the more medical experience. And they typically contract out for forensic pathologists to come do the exam. Some areas don't do that, and they kind of just run however they want. And they have their own rules. Medical examiner's office have pretty set rules and regulations they have to follow when they do cases. Coroner's offices can pretty much pick and choose how they want to do things. I look at it like it's the wild, wild west. It's my best description of it. You just don't know what you're going to get from one office to the other with the coroner system.
Didn't you say that there was actually like a shortage of them as well? Like that there, am I wrong? Like, didn't you say there was like 500 of them?
Yes.
In the country? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of people. It's a very hard thing, it sounds like, to pursue and achieve, because it's a lot more work than just even going and becoming a doctor. It's beyond that.
It's very specialized, and yeah, it's dwindling a lot. And a lot of pathologists that I've even worked with are on the brink of retirement. And it's a shortage. It's really, really bad.
Didn't you also say there were some incentives that some states are offering to help encourage people to get involved, like paying for school? Is that correct too?
Yes, I had heard that in a previous podcast with a medical examiner, and she was saying that there are incentives out there with, taking care of your student loans and different incentives to get these medical examiners into these offices, because they are such a elite part of their system, and they need to get the good ones in there. So they do offer, not all, and I haven't even looked at the research on who does. I just know Broward County in Florida was one of them.
So if any of you are watching and thinking about going into the medical field, there is a huge need for people. If you're slightly interested in crime, if you want to make a difference in the world, there is a huge need for this. So if any of you are watching, maybe consider, if you're in med school, maybe consider it.
Yep.
Wow. Well, we're lucky we have you today, Nikita. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So now, again, that really great education of the autopsy report was spectacular. And so now that'll help us understand what we're looking at in the photos, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So I love to start with photo number 1 that we went through. So let me bring it up so I can look at it too. This photo is of Stephen Smith at the scene. So I know previous discussions, I was so excited to see these photos because, you explained to me kind of what the injuries are, but I didn't realize how significant. This is a very large laceration. And as I spoke to earlier, this is typically caused by blunt force trauma. There is this minor defect, and I'm just going to call it a defect for right now, along the ridge of his eyebrow, and this is on the right side of his face. As I stated earlier, there's a lot of trauma along the right side of his body. So this is what I initially saw. I picked a lot of kind of the same photos because some of them get a little bit clearer, a little bit better. But with this, I can see it's an irregular laceration. So there's like some tissue bridging. Like I said earlier, it's not precise like something would be if a sharp object was used. So if you're ready, we can kind of move on to the next photo, number 2.
Well, real
This
quick,
is a
the
yeah,
circle, what did you use to describe it? You said it was
I
the
said
defect.
defect.
The defect, it's what we're talking about is something that a lot of us thought it looked somewhat circular, that to where people thought, could it have been a gunshot wound? Does that look remotely like anything that you're familiar with looking like a gunshot wound? Does it look like something like there could just be tissue pulled out there?
So
Can you
I'm gonna
any?
get more
Okay.
more into it
Okay.
because there's some pictures that kind of show it a little bit better.
Sorry.
So I was
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
like the next one you see is a little bit of a better shot,
Yes.
photo number 2, where you can see how extensive that laceration is, like all across his forehead, over the ridge of his eyebrow down to pretty much his cheekbone. So again, you can see this defect that I was talking about. I agree, I can see that it's round, but it's hard for me to determine that that is a gunshot wound, and I'll explain why.
Mm-hmm.
From further photos, when we get down the road, I'll kind of explain why I think it's just a defect.
Okay.
But I understand how somebody that can look at that and go, well, that definitely simply looks like it could be a gunshot wound. But the amount of trauma that was done to his head and the size of this defect would not coincide.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
A lot of the first responders and the investigators that show up, if when you look through the report, you can see just how many people initially said gunshot wound. It was almost in everybody's statements. And it's nice to hear you say, yes, you could understand why they would think that, but we'll go into why it actually isn't. So thank you very much for that explanation.
you're welcome. And that's typical. Like that can happen a lot because they see something that looks like it. But to me, after I read through everything and looked at all the pictures, again, it's a little difficult because I'm not physically like looking at the body. So I'm going off the report and the photos that we have. That does not speak to me as a gunshot wound.
Okay.
So the next photo is number 3. This is a photo of Mr. Smith. It's another scene photo. He's face up at the scene. And again, it's just showing me kind of the blood that kind of made its way into his mouth, out of his nose, and the huge laceration across his forehead. And again, you can kind of see that defect over the ridge of his eyebrow. The blood coming out of his nose, and there's photos you can kind of see it coming out of his ears as well. That's from the extensive skull fractures he had. There's something called basilar skull fractures. So you have bones, so you have your skull, and then you have your brain. Your brain is sitting on top of more bones, so it's kind of like the base of your skull. Super, super traumatic, high velocity injuries, like from a car accident. can happen, whiplash, skull gets pretty much smashed, basilar skull fractures, which is the base of what your brain is sitting on. These fractures cause blood to come out of your nose, blood to come out of your ears, and the majority of the time people sustain these injuries, they die. It's very few and far between. I'm not even sure if anyone's actually survived an injury like that. I'm sure there have been, but I'm like, the amount of fractures he had, it was very, very, very significant.
Okay, that just struck me what you said. You said the amount of fractures. So it is, in your opinion, he has more than one blow to the head, or could one blow to the head and the way he landed cause a second fracture?
So this is the hard part about this whole thing, like the mystery behind this, which isn't really the medical examiner's job, but this is where my mind's going, like trying to hypothesize what had happened. Obviously dark road, there's no light at all. It's definitely odd that he left his wallet in his vehicle. Find that very strange. Seems like he's walking in the middle of the road. And if we go to I think it's the next, so two photos forward, I think it's number five, number
Yeah.
five, like you see where his body's laying in the road. I feel like the amount of blood that's under his head, that is around the area that impact happened. Anything face related, you get even just a living person, you get a laceration on your forehead, lacerate your eyebrow, bleed a lot. Your face and your scalp are highly vascular, so you're going to bleed a lot. And so the amount of blood that's there, that's indicative to me that that's around the area that the accident happened, and that he wasn't moved. If he was moved, there would be blood, like clear indication of blood somewhere else. And I don't believe they found anything in the area. Again, what's weird to me, like I said, didn't have his wallet on him, walking in the middle of the road. I find it bizarre that there's no car parts that they found. He definitely wasn't hit head on.
Yeah.
It's definitely some sort of blunt force trauma, basically, is where I'm going with this.
Side view mirror, but I feel like you would have had to have been really close to the car. I don't know how, like, I get that a car could come quickly in the middle of the night, but it is dark. You're going to see the lights. I would think that I can't imagine somebody would get that close to a truck.
And that's where I have a hard time trying to understand how he sustained these injuries, because he was not under the influence of any drugs or alcohol. So he's fully conscious. He's, walking in the middle of the road. How did he not hear a vehicle coming to get out of the
headlights
way? Yes. So there's so many scenarios that could have happened. I mean, it literally could have just been someone drunk behind the wheel. Wouldn't surprise me. Flying down that back road, him not even having the time to respond to move. But like I said, there's no like car parts, and I feel like that's hard to believe if it was a side view mirror, that it hitting him at that velocity, that there wouldn't be pieces, like some sort of piece somewhere, the mirror popping off, like something.
Or just any other markings and scrapings on his legs, his back, if he was hit from behind. He just seems too pristine to have had such massive head trauma that definitely would have tossed his body in some way, and to have no clear landing marks on his hips, his legs, his knees. I don't know, it just seems odd to me. And I do have one other question, and you could answer both of these if you'd like. Could you tell by looking at just the photos if the blunt force trauma was from the back or from the front?
So it's like really hard to determine. I'm really not sure.
Okay.
I wanted in my head, I'm trying to think that it came from the front, just based on the huge laceration that he has, I don't think that would be from him just falling forward, like just how significant that is. And that the force of him, like, I mean, this, whatever happened, like there was some velocity. So I'm saying if it was a vehicle and possibly it wasn't even a side view mirror, could be something that in a truck,
Baseball bat, something.
any sort of object, baseball bat, or even if there's something in the bed of a truck that was hanging over that he wouldn't have even seen coming.
Like
That's true.
Like
piece of wood, like construction wood, or
I've seen tractor trailers with, big loads on the back that have, the oversized loads, and you don't really think about it. And those freaking trucks can haul. And then next thing you know, you get hit. So, like, it's definitely blunt force trauma. There's no question about that. It's just like this mystery of exactly what happened. Of his one arm, I just picked the one arm because they both kind of look the same. It has like this road rash on it, which to me resembles other, like the tons of other cases I've done of pedestrians that get in motor vehicle accidents. So it doesn't look anything like out of the ordinary to me. It just looks like road rash.
okay.
Front of his face, you can really see these scrapes, and that's going to be from just landing and scraping on the concrete. That's indicative to me of, like, again, like a road rash kind of injury.
So my question is, I have a lot about that one. If you were hit like with the blunt force trauma, correct, that went like here up, how would, and like you fall back, how would you get those scrapes? Like, where are those coming from? Like,
So
maybe he just rolled around afterwards, or
it's very possible. It's very, very possible. And getting hit like that, say it did, and again, it's like we don't really know if he got hit from the front or the back. If he got hit from the back, it would probably be more believable because then he'd land and he would scrape his face. But then I would be hard pressed to say he would land face up. And I also would be hard pressed to explain how he got the brainstem stretch, because that stretch that he had that was noted in his autopsy report happens from hyperflexion. So that happens when your head goes like this. And so that's why, to me, it's indicative of getting hit from the front. You get hit from the front, you're snapping your head back. So, I mean, getting hit at whatever velocity he's hitting that ground, his face might have hit, he got the trauma on his right side of his face, but he hits the ground, drops his to the left side and scrapes against the concrete. There's just so many possibilities. There's just so many injuries that happen in a high velocity, like motor vehicle, like accident that can occur on a body.
Okay.
So, like, the fact when you look at his face when he was at the scene, you don't see these scrapes.
Yeah,
That's
and that can
what was really interesting is he's what we consider to be like a type 1 skin type, which is very pale, very sensitive to touch, which made me question, like, could those scrapes have maybe been from like something like, I mean, this, what I'm looking at, that looks pretty, it looks aggressive now, but it wasn't aggressive in the moment. I would have thought, like, does road rash take hours to show up?
It can. It doesn't always show up right away. And it's really from like the drying of the skin. So it dries and it kind of forms almost like a scab. And this is kind of what you're seeing on his face. So, like you said, like he's very fair, but there's this thing, after someone passes away, it's called lividity. And a lot of times in the position someone's in, the blood will pool, it will rest. You can see that he was in a certain position, like based on his photos, you can tell he was laying face up, because on his back, you can see the blood pooling and the lividity forming on his back from some of the other photos. And then like this is just from his skin kind of drying out and that reaction taking place to show those wounds even better. Because the photos that we have are going to be from after the exam, after he's been cleaned up, wiped off, because that's what you do at these exams. You bring like the case in, You typically take photos of somebody that's fully clothed in the clothes that they came in with. You then undress them, take pictures as is, then you start cleaning them up so you can take even better photos of the injuries that you see. So that's really what we're seeing here, is that this is however many days later after the autopsy was done, is that these injuries are just drying out and they're nice and clean.
Okay.
So and one thing that was on the autopsy report, and a lot of people have speculated various things on it. So your answer to this is, I can't wait for it. One of the things she states, Presnell states in her autopsy report, when Stephen Smith was brought to her, she said his body was warm to the touch. Now, we usually think warm, you're alive. You know, considering this significant amount of time before he was there, you would think he would not be warm to the touch. With that said, he was there from the night, and you can see through, time on the crime scene photos, the sun does come up. Is that warm to the touch because he was exposed to the sun, or is there times where bodies do come in warm to the touch?
Yeah, so bodies can 100% come in warm to the touch. It takes a really decent amount of time for a body to fully cool down. So that's what they mean when they bring in a case that's maybe a handful of hours old. That person's still going to feel warm to the touch. When they mean cold, it's more like, all right, this person has been dead for a longer period of time. So they can hypothesize kind of like, this person is still warm to the touch, so it hasn't been such a long time since they passed away.
Okay. And in your expertise, looking at the flow of blood coming from his body, the amount of it, I know you're not there, and you just have to assume in the photos that you're looking at the best you can. Can you also tell about the time that it happened based on how that blood has started to coagulate or thicken, or, I'm sure you could use better, more forensic terms to explain that.
No, you're doing well. Yeah, so there is a lot of factors when that happens, simply because the weather, the temperature outside. Just like if a body's found outside in the summertime, they can start to decompose. Even if they're found an hour or two later, they start to decompose so much faster than someone that's found during the fall or the winter when it's colder, where their body can be found days later and they're still not really decomposing yet. So blood pooling, they can probably come up with a rough estimate, but it's just it's a rough estimate. It's just like how they used to do body temps from the liver. This is old school forensic pathology. I'm not sure many offices do this anymore, but they used to actually put a thermometer in the liver and measure the degree from that, and they could do a calculation to figure out how long that person had been dead for, or go back in time and say it was around this time that this person passed away. But it's just really hard because of the environmental factors that you have.
Understand. And Kelly, one thing you talked about in our last episode was the gash, you referred to it from the back of his head. I'd like you to pose that question to Nikita, because that was really interesting.
Yeah, I was just curious. Well, so you can see in the pictures, there's a dentate, the head kind of caves in. And I wasn't sure, when I was looking at it, not knowing enough about this, could that be from another blunt force trauma, or is that from, without to be grotesque, but when you go through these processes, they remove organs from the body. So I wasn't sure if just moving organs through the brain, could that cause the skull to kind of collapse in, especially I guess if there's fractures? Is that what you believe the denting is from, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Yep, 100%. So that's why I gave us a few of those pictures of the side of his face, so you can see the significant loss of any sort of skull shape.
Yeah.
So what can happen typically when you do a full autopsy? When you go to remove the brain, we do an incision from the back of one ear across the back of the head, behind the other, and you work the scalp up and over the face. I know it sounds grotesque. This is what happens. And then we continue to pull the bottom half of the scalp away as well. And then we take a bone saw and we take off the skull cap, or some people call it, to be formal, the calvarium. So when somebody's skull is whole, like you or I or Shannon, so we have no fractures, it'll come off in one beautiful piece. So after you do an autopsy, you take out the brain, you examine it. It's easy to put that skull cap back on, put the scalp back, sew it up, and it'll look pretty fine. But the amount of trauma he had to his skull and the amount of fractures that there was no putting that skull back together to have his head look whole again. What'll happen is the funeral home will come up with, they're magicians as far as I'm concerned at funeral homes. They can make someone look amazing, and they have the tools and the experience to use some sort of maybe foam or any like caps to give him that shape again if they wanted to do an open casket.
Yeah, I believe Sandy Smith had said that they had to use putty to put his skull back to formation.
Yep, there's so many tips and tricks that they have that they can use to make someone look whole again. It's incredible.
Gosh. All right. I have more questions, but I'm going to let you go through the photos and the ones that you looked at that really stuck out to you. And then, of course, me and Kelly will bombard you with questions.
No problem. So again, I pretty much just discussed the last two the last two photos, which kind of shows how his head, that there were so many fractures from the side. You can see, like you said, Kelly, it was pretty much depressed. Most cases that come in and get autopsies don't look like that. This is definitely showing me traumatic blunt force trauma injury due to the amount of fractures, and that's why he looks like that. And again, this gives you a little bit better look, these last two photos, of that laceration. You can see it's drying now. That's why it's really dark around the edges. And they've stapled it back to try to make it look, better again. But again, we never really did that, because why put more holes in something that the funeral home can take care of properly? But looking at that laceration, I don't see anything indicative either of a gunshot wound. So you would see, if it was a gunshot wound, there wouldn't be such a huge laceration like that. It would be more of like a flower, like a star.
That's what I was thinking, like more deterioration around the skin, where the entrance hole would have gone, correct?
Yeah, even if it's a very small caliber, but you would be able to see some sort of impact on the skin that would show you that. And I just didn't see that through these photos. I think the reason for that hole there is because the ridge of your eyebrow here, it's not a normal flat surface like the rest of our bones in our body. And so when you get injuries, you can get odd defects.
Okay.
So I think that's what happened here. Whatever hit him, it just hit him just right and caused that defect.
Some type of irregular tissue tear, more or less, correct? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm talking about like the actual bone, like the bone where you saw the hole above his ridge of his eyebrow. It's just irregular bone shape. So you can get irregular fractures and defects and stuff like that. And looking at it too, in earlier photos and reading the report, where that hole was on his eyebrow led directly into a huge fracture that led all the way back. And then there was another fracture up here that led all the way back. So it just, to me, is just indicative, not a gunshot wound, but just severe blunt force trauma.
Okay.
And you believe that all of those fractures, the multiple that you just mentioned, could that have happened with one very severe blunt force traumatic hit? Could have caused basically almost like a shattering of his skull?
Given the velocity of whatever hit him, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. And that's the tough thing, is just we don't have that part of the puzzle. Yeah. And it's just such a shame, because like I've seen injuries that are kind of related to this from somebody driving very fast and hitting a pedestrian. So it does not shock me that it wouldn't surprise me him getting hit once at just such a strong, fast velocity and sustaining all these injuries.
Do you think his body, let's just say from the chest down, is equally as intuitive to getting hit with such velocity that it basically shatters a skull, but doesn't have any trauma anywhere else? Is that normal?
It 100% can happen. Like that's why I've been going in my brain the way that this could have happened. I know Kelly, you brought up before, like his shoes were still on his feet,
They're
which is
not even,
kind of,
yeah.
yeah, it's kind of abnormal for a motor vehicle accident. But if he was off to the side, if he was hit head on, he would have all sorts of leg injuries, torso injuries, head injuries, as well as his shoes would have been blown off. There's no question to me about that. The injuries that he sustained and showing that it's so right-sided, just from his skull to his shoulder, is telling me he was obviously off to the side. So it's almost getting sideswiped in a way. And that wouldn't necessarily, even if it was at a fast velocity, it wouldn't knock his shoes off because his legs and his torso aren't being hit. So it's all that force is being passed through his head and like part of his shoulder. But again, like his shoulder could have been after the fact. He could have just gotten hit, landed on his shoulder, rolled, anything. So that's a little bit, just me talking about what I hypothesize about.
Yeah. So are you leaning towards, I mean, it's not unlikely that it could be from something vehicular?
This is the thing with that, which I tried to like look, I really looked over these photos and I try to think in my head if there could have been anything else used. And I just don't see anything on his skin that would lead me to believe that. And I say that because if somebody uses, say, like if they used a bat on him, there would be some sort of bruising that would indicate that he was hit with something long and like kind of circular oblong shaped.
Yeah.
It'll always leave something. And he doesn't have anything like that on his face that I could see. So it makes me hard to say he was hit with something like that. And not like even if like another tool like or a hammer, I've seen hammer injuries before, and that this isn't indicative to me of that. This is like severe blunt force trauma. Like enough. I've seen hammer injuries. I've never seen a hammer injury that caused like such basilar skull fractures and not mess up like really the front of their face. If that makes any sense, because usually someone's coming at you with a hammer, they're gonna mess up the front of your face.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing about looking at this that makes me. It doesn't look as though he was beat up. Like it does, like there's definitely no like other bruises that look like it was necessarily from getting beat up. But it's peculiar. I mean, I still struggle with how he would have gotten so close. If it were a side view mirror, I'm not saying it's not possible. It just was really like hard to grasp because at most trucks you would have to be pretty close to. Although that you almost have to do a study on different trucks and what would hit at that level. You really do because as I said before, I had been hit by like a military truck before that the side view mirror was so large that it actually went over onto the sidewalk and it ended up hitting my shoulder, not my head. But when you think about like, here's the body of the truck, here's the side view mirror, it's got to get far, you've got to get close enough to the truck for that side view mirror to be in front of you to get to your head.
I 100% agree. And that's why when I saw the autopsy report, I looked at his height because to me, looking at his body, he has no abrasions on his legs whatsoever. Because first thing I thought, well, maybe he was on his knees. It's a possibility. But he has no abrasions, nothing on his legs. So that is not going to fly in my head. So he was about 5'9.5". So that's pretty tall. So I drive an SUV and I know that's my side view mirror is not coming up that high. So it had to have been some sort of lifted truck, most likely,
Okay.
or something like a tractor trailer. Like it just had to be something up higher. If that's what like police are going to go with, that's the way they're leaning. It has to be something up high. And like I said, the fact that he was found at 4 a.m. to me, bars close,
Yeah.
people are drunk driving, they're flying. And I guarantee people fly on that back road all of the time. And it would not shock me in the slightest if someone hit him and didn't even realize it and just kept it moving. Like it really wouldn't. It really, really wouldn't. And it's a shame to say, but like it's just I could see that happening. Do I find it hard to believe that he wouldn't have gotten out of the way? I do. So that's the suspicious part to me.
To get hit with that much velocity, you're on top of the truck or whatever it was basically on top of him. So at no, it just seems like, he'd jump out of the way. There would be some attempt to get away from whatever's coming right at him. And I do want to ask, because it's such, when you say it's, a very lifted truck just flying down the road, could those fractures be caused with human strength? Say, you said the bat didn't really leave, the appearance of a bat hitting him, but you did mention if there was a stick or board coming out of the back of a truck, maybe a construction truck. So let's just say somebody, a human being, is swinging a stick, a board, just a 2x4, whatever. Would a human being have enough strength to cause that damage?
Yielding the right weapon, yes. But like I said, it's just hard to see that because there's no like lines on his skin that indicate he was hit over and over and over with something. So it's hard for me to lean towards that. To me, this just looks like one like severe blunt force trauma, like just concussed.
That's what
through him.
But that's what I'm implying. Could one swing by one person cause that?
No.
And
Interesting.
then as far as his feet, I often wonder, just looking at the placement, could he have been sitting there with his knees, with his feet being in that? Like, wouldn't you have expected if he had gotten hit hard enough to kill him, wouldn't you expect his feet kind of to just be knocked back versus being kind of placed on the ground? Or do you think he might have still been alive and tried to move his feet to get up or something? Like, did you find the foot placement peculiar?
I didn't because people when they get hit, they land in all sorts of ways, and it can look like they were just laying there or they just leaned back. I wouldn't be surprised if after he got hit that he did aspirate a little bit. That's why there's blood in his lungs. Because even with all that trauma, your body's still the electrical function's still moving. So he's still probably going to get a few breaths, but I mean, they're just like a death rattle essentially. And that's what would have kind of brought that blood down to his lungs, because like I said, that the trauma he had to his skull was so significant. I would say the majority of the people that get that kind of blunt force severe trauma do not survive.
There is one photo, if you'll recall, it's not in one of the ones that we were specifically going over, but there is one where it's a picture from the back, and it almost looks like and I do apologize for the graphic description of this, but I am looking for your professional insight onto it. It looks as if his skull is peeled, lifted, almost, for lack of a better description, scalped on the back. Is that from the trauma, or is that from the way his head landed? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I know what picture you're talking about. It was just hard for me to use because it was a little blurry. Like some of these, investigators, they don't always take the best pictures at scenes. Yeah. But really what you're looking at is his scalp is very bloody. Like I said, he was face up. So all that blood is pooling behind his head. So first, it's just really bloody. Like there's probably a lot better photos of the back of his head from his actual exam photos that they have, where they would have cleaned all that up. And I don't think he was it was anything like that. I think that the blood was pooling back there mixed with his hair, and there might have been there could have been some more lacerations back there, but I didn't read any of that in the report. So I'm leaning towards that it was just from the blood pooling behind his head and it starting to kind of dry and congeal on his hair. And that's why it looked that way.
Okay. That's a very good explanation, because to me it looked as if, whether he was hit so hard or he landed so hard that the skin came away.
There's definitely something that even almost looked like bruising in one of the pictures back there. But we weren't, it was like a darker color.
Yeah, Kelly. And one of my question was going to be, when we're looking at the funeral home photos, on his neck, that bruising around his neck, it doesn't look as if he had a rope around his neck, but there is a clear line, a darkness, a bruising. Is that from the whiplash?
So this bruising you're talking about, yeah, it 100% can be from whiplash.
Okay.
After the fact, and like I said, after someone dies, he was in that face up position for a while. So what'll happen is the blood will start to pool as well. So lividity is a part of that. So that's what that looked like to me. It didn't look it didn't look like actual somebody grabbed him or hit him there, anything to me. It just looks like from the traumatic injury that he sustained from his head, the fall that most likely happened afterwards, and then the blood finally settling into those injuries that he sustained, especially from that hyperflexion or hyperextension. I'm sorry, hyperextension. Hyperflexion's this. Hyperextension's this. From the hyperextension that he suffered from this blunt force trauma.
And also, you had pointed out to me when we looked at the arms, some of the thing that we found to us peculiar, not having experience with looking at bodies in this way. Some of the markings actually almost looked like diamond shaped prints. They looked versus a regular, they almost looked more like regular shaping. And so I guess one of our questions at one point was, could he have been held down at some point? Could that have come from a boot mark, or you think it looks definitely more, you don't see any patterning?
No, that just looks like road rash to me.
Okay.
I think of you think of the way the asphalt is, it kind of has that pattern in it. So when you get an abrasion from that, it does look like a pattern.
Okay.
So that's why it just looks like that.
Okay.
And that's just from my experience seeing so many motor vehicle accidents and the injuries that people have sustained from them.
Yeah, because his left arm, the one you were looking at and you pointed out to us, that does look like road rash. His right arm looks just so much like a pattern, where there's parts in that pattern that aren't even scraped. They're untouched, as if it was a shoe impression. I'm not saying I'm right by a chance. I'm going to go with your theory. It just looks so different. And it almost looks like it's in a, like this, where the other one just looks like rash. This looks almost rounded.
Well, it would also be hard to wrap a foot around an arm like that. So that's why, to me, this just all reminds me of road rash, rotating his arm while maybe skidding across the asphalt. That's going to cause an abrasion that looks like that.
Okay.
So that's why it just all looks like road rash, like a form of road rash to me.
Okay, fair enough. So how many pedestrian versus vehicle can you say you have experience with?
Oh man. More than I can count. Just like the amount of homicides I've done, more than I can count over almost a 10-year span, and being in a major metropolitan area. Thousands, easily thousands.
Wow.
Incredible. So,
your perspective, do you feel like the autopsy, based on just what you've been able to look at, does it look like it was a fairly reasonable evaluation? Like, do you feel like it doesn't sound like it looks incredibly suspicious to you, right?
Correct. It doesn't
Okay.
read suspicious to me at all. It's laid out just as other autopsy reports I've seen throughout the time I served in that field. And again, I think sometimes there's confusion because not many people understand the death investigation field, like we explained earlier, between the coroner
Yeah.
system and the medical examiner system. That the medical examiner, whoever's certifying the death, I should say, their job is strictly to go off the facts that are given by law enforcement. And that's why they can typically, on most cases, give you the cause of what killed someone. But the manner is typically left up until a law enforcement agency does a thorough investigation and can come back with the facts so they can determine whether it was an accident, whether it was a homicide, anything like that. And even if something was called an accident, like say in this case, I'm not sure, is his case still left undetermined?
I believe so. He was exhumed last week, and they said that the new pathologist, I believe she was a forensic pathologist, has a new manner and cause. I don't think that's been released yet. So I think we might be in that little limbo area right now. I believe, by the way, it's being reported that will change.
Okay. So, even if this was listed as an accident, that doesn't mean the person that caused the accident wouldn't get charged. It just means that the intent of what happened, it was purely unintentional. Like it was an accident. Like say if somebody was flying, like we talked about with the truck and just hit them driving by at 80, 90 miles an hour and just never even thought twice about it. If it was listed homicide, they'd have to be able to prove that somebody chased him down in a vehicle and meant to cause him harm.
Okay.
So that would be what they would need in order to call it a homicide.
Well, I was talking to somebody within the legal system yesterday in South Carolina, and he said to me, you know, Kelly, I don't know if a lot of people understand this. He goes, you know, SLED recently released that it's been deemed a homicide, but he was like, it always has been. He's like, that people are acting like that was a big change. He's like, it wasn't a big change because he said, there are different kinds of homicides. There are misdemeanors. There are, what are the different ones? There's lots of, like, some of them are accidental, so he was killed. He's like, it is a homicide, but we don't know like what type of homicide it is. That's how it was explained to me yesterday. And I think at during this last week or so, it sort of seemed like a big news to all of us. Oh, they finally called it a homicide. But he said that actually wasn't, like, the media has made it sound like it was some big dramatic change, but it isn't. It is a homicide. He is dead. He was killed somehow by something.
Yes, exactly. And police, the way they categorize things are a little bit different than like a death certificate.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times anyone is killed, they're going to give it like a homicide number. And they typically have like different categories in which they place cases into. There have been times where this is clearly a homicide, but they're never going to find who did it, when it happened, nothing like that. So they would give it something called an S number, which is a special number, but it's under the group of homicide. So it's a little bit different than an actual death certificate where, again, like the term of homicide is knowing that this was done with malicious intent.
Mm-hmm.
And forensic pathologists, that's not their job to determine. Like that's the police needing to come to them, be like, we have the proof that this was done with this intent to this individual.
Okay.
And if they don't have that, she wouldn't be able, or whoever was signing the death certificate wouldn't be able to put homicide down. But like I said, it could be marked accident and somebody can be charged with homicide or manslaughter, anything like that.
One question I do have for you, when have you seen this in all of your years of experience? And you work for a medical examiner and a short time for a coroner, has anyone ever simply said hit and run just because of where the body was found? in a road? Or is it based on evidence where you would say hit and run?
It's based on evidence. So it's based on the trauma that the body, has on it, just as, Stephen Smith's case, the blunt force trauma that he experienced, based on the injuries described and seen. And really like the location that they're found in a roadway, that's going to be indicative to me that it leans towards a motor vehicle, like a pedestrian versus a motor vehicle. But a lot of it is based on like the photos, the injuries documented from the scene. So there's never a time that I don't think I ever ran into something where we just like a case came in and we're just like, well, this is just what it is. It was based on all the evidence that we got regarding it in total.
So in this particular case where she is aware that there is no debris, no car remnants, nothing other than some paint chips on his clothing, nothing that doesn't even necessarily come from a car, none of that, would you, or any place that you have your experience from, still would have called it a hit and run without any of that available?
Based on the severity of the trauma and with nothing indicating that someone like physically beat him, yes, especially being found in a roadway. And I agree with how she left it undetermined because, you need the law enforcement side to step up with the evidence that it was either an accident or there was malicious intent to label it a homicide.
Okay. So even with the lack of evidence that there was an automobile or truck of any kind, that still would have led to a hit and run. So in other words, evidence guides you to what you're going to determine. Does lack of evidence then make you not go in that direction?
So it's like a puzzle. So you put the puzzle together when you're doing death investigation like this. So just because a car isn't there at the moment and there's no pieces of a car, there's no like nothing of that sort, doesn't mean a car wasn't there and didn't cause the trauma.
Okay.
So and that's why it's like kind of like you gather all the evidence and like looking at the injuries sustained, and they had to have been caused by significant blunt force trauma. The level of the injuries done in the skull. And that's why I said, like, to me, it's kind of hard to look at pictures, but it's not indicative of a gunshot wound at that little hole. Because I've seen little holes of like a 22 that someone gets shot with on a skull, and I've never seen trauma that significant from a 22. So, and I would expect to see more at the entrance. I would expect to see more from the skin that was lacerated. But again, it's kind of like, it's one thing to be there with the body and be able to be like, oh, this is stippling from a gunshot wound, or this is just his freckles on his face. So,
Sure.
relying on like the report and the photos that I'm seeing, I don't see that as indicative of a gunshot wound. And even thinking of it, like some people might say, well, it could have happened and then they caused these injuries to him. I just don't see that either, because it just doesn't look like the skin has that trauma, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and one of the things, I mean, just another one to roll out, but when I had heard somebody say it could have a gunshot wound that would be that minimal would be something like a small gun, like a Taurus. So I had to look that up. It's like one of those little guns, but like if there really wasn't any kind of like deterioration, like that looked almost like a hole in the skin that I could see either. But like, would you have even think maybe like a small gun could that have done it?
Yeah, so that's what I was kind of going at with like a 22 caliber is a very, very small bullet. And those typically they'll come in and they'll just bounce around, for lack of a better word, because they slow down so much that they can't exit. And to me, it just wasn't indicative of that. at all, especially with the amount of the trauma that he had in his skull and like just how many fractures he had in total.
Okay. So it could have been something from a moving object.
Absolutely. And that's why just trying to think about it is like, even if a tractor trailer, like I said, had an oversized load on it and is flying down that road at night, and he gets hit with something, that's hanging off the side that maybe he doesn't even, he can't see. There's no lights back there. There's no lights at all. So,
or could he have been running in the middle of the road trying to wave somebody down, asking them to stop, and maybe they didn't see him and stop? I mean, I have thought
100%.
about that. Or could he have been walking and turned around and then boom? Because that would have to, at that angle, I would think if he were walking with traffic, in order to get hit where he was hit, you'd have to have like turned around to face the traffic coming. It's still bizarre to me that he's in the middle of the road, but then that would be, could he have been in the middle of the road trying to wave somebody down to stop and help? And
according to the family and the friends,
he wouldn't have
the fact
gone.
that he would be even walking down that road was so out of character. He was skittish. He would never, ever have gotten into a car. They were adamant about this with a stranger for any reason. So, though what you're saying, Kelly, is a very possible normal reaction that people would do, especially if their car had broken down or what have you, it just doesn't seem to be in character with Steven.
But what if
that again is still just hypothesizing?
Absolutely. But what if he had called someone and he was expecting someone to come? Maybe like, what if it was someone he was expecting?
Yeah.
Like, what if you had been able to call someone? I mean, we still don't know his phone records. I'm just throwing out like that's what we're doing, is everything here is a what if. What if he was expecting somebody? What if it wasn't just, what if to him this wasn't like possibly a random person? Like if I'd called someone, that's different, right? So we
or if he wasn't, like they said, he would have hid in the bush. What if that exactly is what he did? Saw the headlights, figured it was the person coming to get him, steps out in the road, boom, gets hit, or stepped out even not totally out in the middle of the road. But if you were a truck or a lifted truck, a construction truck, and you had, a big board, that you're about to do massive construction at a house or anything really, and he goes out to try to say, hey, this might be my ride, doesn't go anywhere near the car because the car or the truck's over there, but this projectile that's hanging out of the truck is actually what gets him. He wouldn't have even seen probably what was hanging out of the truck. He would have just almost been blinded by the headlights coming towards him and not being able to see what was sticking out.
And that's a thing too, like one of the things that I have for protection is I have a keychain with like a bright light, something this small, to blind anybody like who would come. And by the way, women, get you one. It's a wonderful thing, and you're not going to hurt yourself with it. But if somebody's coming at you, you could quickly blind them and get out of the way. But yeah, like if this can blind someone, I imagine like headlights could possibly daze and confuse someone.
And like you said, it would have been lifted, something larger. That would have been direct, almost eye level if he's walking.
Been expecting someone and like gone out thinking this is my ride, this is my person, and they don't see him or they don't stop. Maybe it was malicious, maybe it wasn't, but could Absolutely. That be a possibility? I mean, that would be something I would think that would put him in a place that we wouldn't expect him to be.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Absolutely.
It is strange based on everything they said that he's in the road. So perhaps there was something that made him think that was safe to be there. Would be, I don't know.
It's a very good theory. It makes sense with them saying that he would have hid off to the side and then come out when his ride got there. They actually describe that has happened in the past when his father, his sister would go get him. And very logical.
So maybe this was something like that where somebody missed him and he was like coming out to wave. I don't know. I wish we knew.
I know there's just so many possibilities. It's just so hard. Like you sit here and kind of speculate. It's almost a shame that whatever happened, whoever might have hit him, like give the family closure. Like, because really that's to me what it's all about. There was obviously blunt force trauma, and like sustained from this, whatever occurred. And it's just really giving his mother that closure. Because I mean, she deserves that. Family deserves that when this happens.
And what I appreciate is, I mean, I feel good about the fact that I feel like this is an unbiased approach that we're doing. Like, obviously, I went out and found somebody that I have full confidence in with experience. And, you know, we were leaning, thinking that it was, I personally was leaning, thinking it was something else. So I do appreciate hearing from someone who I don't think is coming from an agenda perspective, saying, this doesn't look odd to me the way that it was presented or ruled. So I do appreciate that so much, Nikita. Thank you.
No problem. Like I told you, and that's really the job of somebody that works in that field, like a forensic pathologist, autopsy tech, whoever, is that we have to go into it and just take the facts that are presented with us and work with those facts. I can speculate about what happened, but I can't speculate about the trauma that is clearly evident in the photos and in the autopsy report. So that's really what I went off of. And I'm really interested to hear what they found from exhuming his body and what they have to say. I mean, there's going to be a lot of tissue breakdown. So really, to me, they're not going to be left with much to work with. So I'm really interested to hear what they have to say.
Yeah. And for anyone who's watching, like we only have the bit of information that's available to us. So we're absolutely like, we're not out here saying this is exactly what it was, but we're also saying based on what's been available, it doesn't look as, you know, possibly strange maybe as we'd once thought. But I still look forward to hearing what they have based on lots of information that we don't have. You never know. I'm curious. So it's been what, 7 years, I think. Is that correct, Shannon?
2015, July 2015.
So typically, yeah, what is there? Is that usually, would you imagine it would just mostly be like skeletal type stuff that somebody would be able to evaluate as typically?
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of tissue breakdown. I'm sure being that he was at a funeral home, I'm going to assume that he was probably embalmed, which is going to help, but there's going to be tissue breakdown. I mean, that's inevitably going to happen. And it's just going to be, I don't really know what more they're going to be able to look at. I mean, maybe they're going to look at that wound, that defect that I talk about, and maybe maybe look at the scar. But to me at this point, like, he's going to be, you know, having been deceased since 2015, stuff is not going to look the same as it did then, and even a year later. So I'm very interested to hear what they have to say. And I think they brought in a forensic anthropologist too, which would be great to like really look at the bone, be able to tell really what that defect was, and help them out in that aspect.
Yeah, I think
at this point.
Yeah, they did tissue samples, x-rays. They were very happy with what they were able to do. Now we're just, you know, waiting for the results to be released.
And I know from reading the report, they said they did x-rays on the head and neck when they brought him in, and they did not see anything. So they didn't see, and if there was something there, they should have been able to see something that they would have been able to pull out of like the brain tissue of his scalp, anything. And even if there was a small bullet, they should have been able to pull that out. But again, it's just like, I'm really interested to hear what they have to say. And from reading the report, I didn't read anything about any like lacerations to the back of his head, which I would have expected if this was a gunshot wound. That obviously if there's nothing in the x-ray, there has to be an exit somewhere. There has to.
Okay.
So I didn't read anything that explained like another laceration that could have possibly been an exit wound either.
Yeah, I believe she even stated it was not a gunshot wound in her opinion in the report.
And I'd also like to hear results on the rape kit. It's clearly not the rape, but it would give you an idea if there was possibly any malicious or foul play at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you did, and it did say like SLED does have the rape kit.
Yes.
They've confirmed. Yeah.
I'm surprised they didn't run it back then, because like
Maybe they
given the
did.
I would hope so, because given the circumstances, like him just being found on a back road like that, you're kind of gonna go like full out in the exam that you're gonna give, and those kind of things I would have hoped they should have been run.
So you would have too done a rape kit, or that now they refer to it as a sexual assault kit. That would have been,
Like given the circumstances of him being found on the back road, like the little bit of the uneasiness of not really knowing what happened, and like you said, Kelly, people on scene were like, this is a gunshot wound, this is a gunshot wound. So I mean, just to cover all bases, because if you don't do something and stuff comes back and you don't have that stuff to back it up, you're missing your opportunity. A great example of that is in the medical examiner system, any possible overdose that comes in gets a full exam. Full exam is a full autopsy, because whether they were found with a needle in their arm and bags of drugs around them, if their toxicology comes back clean and you didn't do a full autopsy, you're kind of like left. You can't say, like, you can't go back to a family and say, oh yeah, we did everything we can. You should just do one. Even if everything looks fine in the autopsy, you can say you did it, so you covered all your bases.
okay.
I feel really good. I appreciate it. I mean, obviously that sort of changes my mental direction in some ways, but I appreciate that it's honest. Like, these are things that I'm not a professional. I don't know what I'm looking at. So it's really helpful to have your perspective. And I'm really grateful, and I appreciate that I trust it coming from you.
No problem. I'm happy I was able to give you guys some insight.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Kelly, Nikita, thank you both for being, here on Forensic Friday today. Kelly, as always, you have such great insight and theories and very possible possibilities. I love the way just your brain is always fired up with that. Nikita, I am in awe of all of the information you gave today. I feel so much more informed, and I've had that report and I've had those things, but to hear you break it down line by line, go through, the injuries, go through her process in the autopsy, then go through these photos that, we have looked at, but to see them through your eyes, I think you're spectacular. And I am so, so thankful that you took time out of your crazy schedule and all that you do to go over everything with us. This was fantastic.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.